We begin part 2 of the lecture by looking at the complete demographic transition model. You'll note that in addition to the 5 stages previously covered, I've included some key terms like population explosion, demographic dividend, and graying population. At the top of the stages, you'll see I entered some countries: Mali for stage 2, Brazil towards the end of stage 3, about to embark on stage 4, China, our stage 4 example, Japan and Russia in stage 5, and you'll note the United States straddling stage 4 and stage 5. What's unique about the United States is that our population would begin to even out and decline if not for immigration. Immigrants, as you'll recall, are generally arriving younger, and they are also arriving for economic reasons. So they're helping to stabilize our population by being within that childbearing age and also contributing economically to our dependents. The population explosion that you see in the middle end of stage 2, again, that's when public health, that's when diets improve, that's when having a better understanding of hygiene improves, and we're seeing that fewer babies are dying. Towards the end of stage 3, a country hits what's called its demographic dividend, and this is a very important time. During this time, we have increased productivity and low dependency costs, meaning our population is young, it's economically active, and we have fewer elderly members of our population that rely on social services and create social costs. The transition to stage 3 and 4 also reflects higher female participation in the workforce, a lower total fertility rate, and again, our elderly population is relatively low during this time. This demographic dividend is something that needs to be caught because it doesn't last long. Our population will age, and as those working age cohorts advance and live longer, those social costs begin to add up, those dependency costs begin to add up. The United States hit its demographic dividend in the 1950s and 60s. Countries like Brazil today that have experienced tremendous economic growth in the 21st century are now taking advantage of their demographic dividend. China, on the other hand, which saw tremendous growth in the early 21st century and 1990s, is beginning to phase out of its demographic dividend. On the other end, we have what's known as a dependency ratio. And a country like Japan that's aging in place with a very low fertility rate and very low birth rate, they're beginning to see as their population ages, it creates a tremendous economic strain on the country. As these individuals live longer, enter retirement, the social cost of maintaining an elderly population continues to grow. This graphic from the reading shows us the dependency ratio in a number of different countries. And this may be a little easier for some of you to digest than what's seen on the demographic transition model, where Japan only has 13% of its population under 15 years of age. The median age of Japan is 61, over double that of India. And you can see the working population is only 46%, meaning over half of the country would be considered a dependent. And in Japan, that half is made up heavily of an elderly population, because the young population, the cohort that's going to support the older population as it moves into the workforce, is very small. This graphic shows us dependency ratios in an idea known as double dependency. Double dependency reflects a high number of individuals, a large percentage of your population, both under 15 and elderly. You'll notice that Africa has a high child dependency, meaning that we have a large percentage of our population that will enter the workforce as it ages. So most of these African nations have not hit their demographic dividend yet. So economically, as long as countries remain stable, the economic future looks promising as we have our biggest cohorts, our biggest groups of the population moving into the workforce. You'll notice places like China, Russia, most of Europe, Canada have a high old age dependency. Again, meaning that their population is aging, the dependents are moving into retirement, and there's fewer young children to come along to support them. Double dependency exists in places like the United States, where we have a moderate child dependency ratio, and we also have a growing older elderly population that needs to be supported. So again, if our country continues to maintain a low fertility rate and low birth rates, we are going to age in place and end up like Japan. So immigration supports us economically and also supports us with our population. We're going to wrap up our look at population geography with another visual tool. And this is known as a population pyramid. And the population pyramid is based on fertility and mortality. This is the world at the end of 2018. It is a pyramid, which means that the base, the younger cohorts, are bigger than the middle-aged and elderly cohorts. As long as you have a pyramid shape, your population will continue to grow. And that's the case with our global population. If you recall from the beginning of this lecture, we anticipate our global population will near 10 billion by the middle of this century. The x-axis, the axis that goes horizontal at the bottom, shows our cohort size. And you can see we're pretty balanced here with the global population, but our youngest cohorts are the largest. And our y-axis, the vertical axis, shows us our age. So if you go up and you look at 75 to 79, you'll see that less than 2% of the global population is actually 75 to 79, and it gets smaller as you go up. But the biggest cohort for our population remains at the bottom, where nearly 9% of our global population is under 4 years of age. Mali, our example for stage 2, reflects an extreme pyramid, meaning our youngest cohorts are by far the largest. So stage 2, if you recall, we have a decreasing death rate, meaning that these cohorts that are big at the base will continue to move up. We have an economy based on agriculture, so that large families are desired. As healthcare improves and more children live longer, tradition is slower to respond, meaning women are going to continue to have kids. Large families are tradition, passed down generation to generation, and that type of tradition takes longer to break. So even after the fertility rate declines, even after women are, instead of having 6 kids, are dropping down to 3 or 4, this population has what's called demographic momentum, meaning those broad cohorts at the bottom are going to move up, and this pyramid is going to continue to expand in the teenage, early 20s, middle age, and elderly cohorts. The graphic on the bottom left shows Mali's anticipated growth by 2100, and while we're under 20 million today, we're looking at over 90 million in the next 80 years. China is another example, and this is a stage 4, and you can see here that we're moving away from that pyramid shape, where now our biggest cohorts are actually in their 20s and 30s, and also 40s and early 50s. And China is a bit of a unique case, and this is because of what was known as the one-child policy. China had a broad base like Mali. China had a base that was going to project a population growth that the government didn't feel it would be able to support. China is a communist government, so basically all aspects of life are covered by the central government. And the government said we're growing too fast, we don't have jobs, we don't have food for a population, so couples were limited to having one child. Now this created a significant demographic imbalance where male babies were favored over female babies. And also we saw that projecting our population out, we were going to have issues that places like Japan are facing today, where our dependency ratio with our elderly group would be too large for the country to sustain. So recently, in the last several years, China created what's called the 1.5 child policy, where many couples were permitted to have a second baby. But China is a very interesting case. This is the most extreme example of population planning. You can tell by the graphic on the bottom left that China's population is set to peak in the next 10, 20 years, and then it will decline. So while the math behind this one-child policy worked at slowing population growth, the demographic concerns remain, as this population now is imbalanced between men and women, and it's also aging. So they created, perhaps artificially, a high elderly dependency ratio. Stage 3, towards the end of stage 3, is where we find Brazil. Again, Brazil has narrowed out from that broad base in stage 2. And again, the factors here: increased urbanization and mechanization. The status of women is moving towards more equality, as women are now pursuing education and careers, which pushes off having children. The total fertility rate, when we strive for gender equity and when we move towards urbanization and mechanization, that TFR rapidly decreases. And again, this shape of Brazil reflects that demographic dividend. In stage 5, we find Portugal. And you can see here how we've lost that pyramid shape and we've moved more towards a beehive. You can see here where the majority of the population is over 40 years old. Portugal is not facing the outcome of any type of population planning. It's facing the outcome of an evolved economy, an aging economy, a society where smaller families were valued. Portugal is facing a serious demographic situation in the 21st century. Its population is expected to drop by over 25% by 2100. This leads us to this concept of a demographic collapse, where the dependents, both the old and the young, are likely going to go unsupported by the working age population. So this is a very concerning situation for this century for Portugal. Without immigration, without a growing economy that's going to attract people from across Europe and other parts of the world, Portugal faces a very uncertain future as we move through the 21st century. When we look at the United States population pyramid, we see that it's not as tapered at the bottom as what we found in Portugal. It looks a little bit more like what we saw in Brazil, but we are stable. Our life expectancy is increasing, so those older cohorts will continue to expand. We have seen increased gender equality, which has led to a lower fertility rate as women are spending more time in school and then spending more time to advance their careers and putting off having children. So while our fertility rate looks at women between the ages of 15 and 49, as we move towards a more equal workforce and more equal schooling, we see that that pushes off having children many times, in many cases 15 years or more. So women are not beginning to have children until their 30s rather than their late teens, which we would find in stage 2. And as you can see in the graphic on the bottom left, the United States population is projected to grow through the end of the 21st century, and a large part of this, again, is through immigration. There are a couple outliers, and the first outlier is Russia, and you could see this mismatched shape here. Russia went through an economic collapse when the Soviet Union ended in the late 1980s. You can see that fertility rate went from 1.8 to 1.1 in 1999. That has recovered a little bit to 1.7 today. You could also see the devastating toll the economic and, for a large part, social collapse had on men in Russia. The life expectancy for men dropped all the way down into the 50s. And you could see really this imbalanced population pyramid. Alcoholism took a heavy toll on the male population in Russia in the 1990s and early 2000s. You can see the long-term prospects for the Russian population are not great, as it's projected to really rapidly decline by 2040. So Portugal is facing a demographic collapse, and Russia is also facing a significant demographic crisis, much sooner than what we're going to find in Portugal.